Okay, hi everybody. Lovely to be here. Wish I could come to Bremen sometime again. Yeah, I hope you enjoy your fall school and hope you enjoy this talk also on event-predictive active inference, where I want to show you essentially our work from the psychological side on the one hand side, less so the focus will be on active inference and computational models that essentially develop conceptual compositional structures, cognitive capabilities, or cognition in general from sensorimotor experiences. And of course, there are lots of terms here now that you're not fully familiar with, I guess, so I'm trying to get you on stage with some intuition. Actually, the first intuitive picture you see on the right here, where you see this lovely art image, actually a composite photograph that hopefully you all see how the terrace here, that seemingly a terrace, kind of bends up into a terrace that comes out from nowhere. So this checkerboard kind of structure here bends for you. And why does it bend? Because your brain desperately tries to form a consistent image of consistent interpretation, rather, of what it sees or what it perceives, and that's a kind of active inference actually at work there. Another example of our brain continuously trying to kind of explain away the perceptions, interpreting its perceptions in the light of the current situation. And lo and behold, here it is actually the light that we perceive surrounding, for example, this cube, that makes us believe that that here in this yellow scenario, we have blue spots here, and in the bluish light scenario, you have these yellow spots here. And lo and behold, these blue and yellow spots are not blue and yellow at all, or at least they are not in terms of the grayscale values on your monitor, but they are gray. Yeah, they're fully gray, and it's hard to believe really that this is gray, but it is gray in terms of really the actual grayscale values. But in the real world, actually, lo and behold, under such yellow light conditions, this spot would actually be blue, and it would still perceived as like the color that hits your eye would be gray, and that's why we perceive it as blue. Yeah. So what I'm saying is essentially that our brain totally also subconsciously perceives the world as in an interpretive manner, right? It takes the sensory information and translates it into the most likely causes in the environment that cause the sensory information. In this case, under yellow light conditions, blue field in the environment will cause gray impression on the eyes, and that's why our brain infers that this must be blue. And here it's inverted, and so it must be yellow, the gray parts, right? So we take into account all the information that we have, the sensory perceptions, and our brain tries to interpret the world to its best, to the best of its knowledge, to the best of its own experience. Another more complex example of this are these shadow figures here. So you see two shadows of two people on the left and right here, and we all know what shadows are, and so you might now think, yeah, okay, cool. My interesting shadow looks a little weird, probably from some person sculpture, or actually person might actually be standing there, and I took a photograph of it, and so there's some light source and a person, and that creates the shadow. But that's the brain's explanation typically of it, if you think about it. But if I show you the true image, then you see, oh wow, okay, cool, interesting There can actually be a really strange sculpture that doesn't look like a human at all, but projected in the right way with the light position, the light source position in the right way and projected in the right direction. We actually get a shadow of a person. And also in this other case, lo and behold, we have a similar situation. So, yeah, I hope quite intriguing and meaning essentially that what the brain does, right, is it infers essentially the best explanation it come up with under the sensory, under the information about the environment that is provided. And once we have more evidence what's actually going on in the environment, like these strange sculptures, we actually revise our interpretation of what we see or what we interpreted. And so there's actually not a person standing there, but a strange sculpture creating this. So the first message I want to convey today is essentially that our brain, there's lots of evidence that our brain is a generative predictive model who's currently active encoding, so the neural activities essentially themselves, right, try to predict and thus explain away the current sensory perceptions. That's what's often used, is explaining away the causes or the sensory perceptions, essentially inferring the causes behind the sensory perceptions. That's the predictive coding jargon that you see in the free energy world a lot. And this is where we come from. We essentially characterize a generative predictive model a little bit more concrete on this slide with those active predictions that explain away perceptions. The generative predictive models essentially maintain distributed predictive activities, that is our neural activities in our brain, which form kind of attractors with local free energy minima. That means, and what are these attractors? That's something to intuitively understand. For example, in the shadow situation, like our attractor was the interpretation that, okay, there must be a light source, some person in the middle, and the shadow thus producing the shadow. So we never saw the person or the light source, but we imagined that there was a person in the light source. And then when I uncovered the sculpture situation, right, you actually replaced the person with a sculpture and more or less fell in this kind of local attractor. And we can explain this attractor being like having activated in our brain a certain set of, for example, entities or other thought components that together as a whole explain away what we see, right? So that's the attractor, and that can be formalized in terms of free energy or local free energy. That is essentially, simplistically, you can think of free energy as prediction error, at least for now, but it's going to get a little bit more complicated than that. Because the free energy formalism essentially can push these neural activities that are predictive by nature in kind of yielding three types of activity adaptations of this generative predictive model. The first one is the very fast interpretive activity adaptation that is essentially encoding what seems to be going on right now, like that these spots are blue or yellow, or that there's probably this figure in the light source creating the shadow. That's the fast adaptation of model activities towards this local free energy minima, typically retrospective or on the fly direct. Second, you learn, as you have learned maybe today actually already, that there can be these cool sculptures that can be arranged such that they create like human figures, shadow figures. So you have adapted your internal knowledge about the world, adapting essentially your generative predictive model structures, the weights in a neural network. And then the third component is the behavioral component that is essentially acting upon the environment such that you pursue certain predicted, prospected, expected free energy minima. We will see that this goal-directed behavior embedded in this model with the same formalization actually as knowing what is going on and learning more about the world can be used to generate robots that are acting goal-directed and epistemically so seeking for information in the environment in a very effective manner. To boil down the point again, let me use this illustration here still about it. So we have essentially these three types of inferences that are unfolding, these three types of free energy pushes, free energy inference mechanisms that are unfolding. And the first one, if we are in this situation and we are kind of in the present, so our brain is in this predictive state of mind, being essentially, for example, when you take this image, ready or busy writing a letter, just starting with "Dear Scholar," for example, or maybe something else will be written here. Who knows? But clearly we are in the present and we have come from the past, just having had particular state estimates about the pencil, for example, the paper, the situation that I'm currently in, that I'm sitting in, and so forth. And we get feedback from writing, essentially, and so we might adjust the present to a little bit an adjustment, because possibly the pencil is a little bit more wiggly or maybe too pointy here in this case, or something like this. So we might adjust our present and thus adjust our pressure, how we write, and so forth. And we also possibly learn about the environment more while writing, improving our writing skill, for example, or knowing how pencils write on this paper. And the third inference component is the one that then reaches into the future. For actually the other two really are only for the third one, which is to act with the environment in a clever way, meaning essentially considering future states, future developments, such as I'm writing this letter, I'm writing the next word, I want to create a letter to be sent to a friend, I have other issues done in this day, and these future considerations are then compared with my desires, my intentions that I want to achieve maybe today while writing this letter, what I want to all put in, and so forth. And this comparison between the desired future state, finalizing letter, writing particular messages in the letter, and so forth, and the current state, right, or the considered future, I can use this in this epistemic goal-directed manner to actually pursue my present in a goal-directed manner and adjust my motor commands accordingly, such that my future considerations, my imagined future considerations, agree to my desired future considerations. And this, maybe I skip this, we can also write it like this, and this unfolds continuously over time, dynamically, while I think about the environment, while I'm receiving sensory information and adjusting my model according to the sensory information over time and acting goal-directedly. The formalization of this can be done by this free energy based equation, and the most accessible one I always found is the paper by Friston et al. With Giovanni Pezzulo in 2015, where we relate the free energy directly to our behavioral policy, because this is anyways the focus if you also want to work with robots and control artificial systems. And we define this free energy that we continuously want to minimize as an equation with two terms. But let me first briefly we relate this equation to policy pi, starting at a certain point in time t, so a current moment essentially. And the policy pi is essentially a mapping from internal states to actions. And we consider the free energy with a temporal horizon tau into the future. So starting from t, tau is essentially the future horizon that goes from t up to, say, a fixed number of time steps. But this very much here, this depth, how you go into the future, depends on your mental capacity and also on the predictive models that you have in your mind. We'll get to that later. And so the minimization of this essentially has two components. The first one is the goal-directed component. It's measured as the difference or the divergence, the KL divergence in the end, when you think about it all probabilistically, between where you believe you end up in, so what you are going to observe when following a particular policy pi, contrasted or measured the divergence of with where you want to come to, what's your internal desired model states, m tau in the future, pursuing a particular so meaning like that your desire to maintain, for example, not overly thirsty bodily state, feeling generally comfortable and secure, and all these things. And these lead also to particular observational states, and you compare those observational states with the ones you believe you will end up in when you follow a particular policy pi. And you want to stay comfortable, so you want to go with your policy pi not too far away, essentially, from your comfort zone, so to say, from your internal homeostatic state that can, of course, contain also the desire of writing a letter, for example, finalizing a letter, pursuing your courses of study, but also just not getting too thirsty. So this is the one part of the desired, of the goal-directed equation. The other one is the expected future uncertainty. Essentially, the expected over the temporal horizon, the expected entropy H, measured as the entropy of the observations given you follow a policy pi and are in a certain mental state, internal model state M, due to this policy pi also in the future, and the expectation of this entropy over your expected future state by following the policy pi. So these two components are very critical to guide your system. The one essentially yields goal-directedness, and the other one yields epistemic behavior, avoiding high uncertainty, but also notice that depending on the temporal horizon tau, you can accept temporary uncertainty by gaining knowledge and expecting more longer-term certainty. So this is the argument against the dark room problem for those who are aware of that. We have now implemented systems like this, approximations of these systems with recurrent neural networks. Here you see a very simple implementation still from 5 years ago now, published in 2017 at ICANN, where we control this little rocket ball here. It's a 2D simulation with gravity and inertia. And this rocket ball has these two thrust motors, which can, as you essentially intuitively hopefully see, can control its flying through this space. It receives the goals. The green dots are the goals that are given here supervised from the outside. And the red line that extends towards the goal typically is essentially nothing else than the imagination of the system itself, where it's going to fly to when it imagines executing a particular series of motor commands, that is a particular series of thrust activities. You see this here in this recurrent neural network. It essentially starts from the present t and follows a policy pi. These are the axis here, t plus 1, t plus 2, the imagined motor commands that are executed, leading to the anticipation of ending up in a certain state. And you can compare this with a desired state, S star, and backpropagate the error simply by gradient descent, backpropagation through time, onto the motor commands, motor neurons or motor neuron biases, you can call them. And so you adjust your motor neurons, your motor neuron activities, so you imagined motor activity in the future according to where you want to end up in, and thus execute the next motor command. This is also very closely related to model predictive control and control theory. You can also do this by not having a temporal prediction in the future, but having a kinematic prediction along a multi-joint robot arm. And so here it's the kinematic change as predicted. The error is at the tip. You want to have a certain position that you want to reach, as again is here given supervisedly. And then you again take the difference between this and propagate it back through the kinematic chain actually, and thus generating control commands for each of these links. And so you get pretty neat behavior with additional sensors here. These little green hairs, as they look like, are collision sensors that is immediately generate a local gradient in the opposite direction from the sensory information, and thus the system avoids collisions. Meanwhile, so I hope you saw already. Okay, there's some potential in this. You can have essentially a system when it learns a predictive model of its sensorimotor dynamics. It can essentially predict into the future quite well and use this prediction as a model predictive control-like approach in a dynamic neural network to adjust behavior. However, I have promised more than this, right? I'm not only talking about active inference here. This is essentially basic active inference without probabilities implemented in a recurrent neural network. But I wanted to show you also event predictive structures. And this leads to the second proposition, essentially, of my talk today, essentially that it appears that because we cannot always continue, we don't have the capacity essentially to think through all options, how to interact with the environment in a continuous fashion. We have to kind of segment things in a way that we can think conceptually about it. Okay, if I want to get myself a coffee, I have to get up to go to the kitchen, put water in a machine, and so forth and so forth. Yeah, so I have to think on this abstract level somehow. Where does this abstraction come from? Starting inevitably from my sensorimotor experiences. And it appears that there is an evolutionary shaped inductive processing bias in our brains discovered by evolution. I would argue that biases our predictive model development towards developing event predictive compositional structures, which essentially, because they're very suitable, these biases, and they reflect what's going on in the real world, they tend to model the hidden causes behind sensory perceptions. So what are these events? What are these? I've talked now here essentially about this event predictive compositional structures, right? So what are these events? The event have been characterized as a segment of time at a given location that is conceived by an observer to have a beginning and an end. So very general characterization of events. An event being something where something unfolds in a systematic manner. And this unfolding starts at some point and typically ends at some point. So it's a stretch of time where something is kind of consistent. Interestingly, it has been characterized recently by Dare Baldwin with this quote that I show you in a second, that these events, lo and behold, as I just have claimed in the second proposition, essentially are constructed by our own minds. Yeah, they have written that events, the experiences we think we are having and recall having had, are constructed. They are not what actually occurs. Because what occurs actually is ongoing dynamic multidimensional sensory flow, which is somehow transformed via psychological processes into this structured, describable units of experience. And these events, these event experiences for machine learning, for robotics, I think is totally essential to uncover how we can segment this continuous sensorimotor stream of information that we all have, that robots in the end have. The data flows in all the time without any stopping, without any direct signals of starts and endings, unless we cheat and give it just episodes and segment it for the system. Then we have to uncover how can the system really work with this, how can the system realize this, and realize essentially detect events from sensorimotor streams. And this has developed into more or less a research field by now. And this research on event-predictive cognition essentially investigates what I just said, how events and conceptualizations of these events essentially are learned, structured, and processed dynamically. And interestingly, the ongoing research that is covered in this special issue on topics in cognitive science essentially suggests that event-predictive encodings and processes optimally mediate between sensorimotor processes and language. And if you are not so interested in language, we could also replace language here in this quote with conceptual or hierarchical reinforcement suitable structures. So really enable planning, reasoning on abstract levels, starting with sensorimotor processes. Yeah, this events have essentially been around in various domains. In language also a lot. I haven't covered it here, more relating to the theory of event coding. You might have heard from Bernhard Hommel and colleagues. My former supervisor Joachim Hoffmann has worked on anticipatory behavior control a lot, as have Wolfgang Prinz. And then we also have the event segmentation theory, which set the groundwork of this theory of event predictive cognition, at least for me, has set the groundwork. And lo and behold, the special issue came out this year, actually in the spring, covers quite a couple of topics. So if you're further interested in this, have a look at these diverse papers that cover linkage to language, development of the networks with artificial systems, development of predictive representations in general, the linkage to neuroscience, default network in the brain, and also signals of surprise in the brain. And then also the close relation to action execution and event perception and the linkage between the two, because in the end they work with the same kind of mechanism. So these event predictive structures I'm talking about are essentially distributed networks that typically predict types of entities, their relative spatial duration, and their interaction dynamics. Yeah, like in the shadow situation, we had a static state where we had a shadow image, a person, and a light source, or actually a sculpture and a light source. And we have event boundaries that predict conditions under which events start and end. So, for example, switching on the light will create the shadow, for example, and switching it off will stop being in that shadowy situation. And together in these two systems, we try to build artificial networks that actually compactly encode these structures, forming event schemata, how they have been characterized in cognitive science and also language partially before, but without the grounding to sensorimotor cognition. And out of these schematic structures that essentially bind events and boundaries of them in a systematic manner, we form event hierarchies out of that. So this means essentially that where we are at right now is nothing else as a system where we write a letter, for example, but we're not only in the here and now and just unfolding this letter dynamics, but we also think conceptually about it. So it makes sense to actually have particular events and event transitions unfolding and not only one event that we are in. And possibly I should have even written this hierarchically, right? There's not only one event sequence that we are considering, but also multiple hierarchical levels. Just think of the idea of writing a full letter versus just writing this one word, or thinking about actually posting a letter to a friend overall. So there are different hierarchies that you can think of, and this closes the loop again in this event predictive manner. A nice illustration for a short mental break, possibly for you also, is this this video here. There's a little cool video project here from this guy at the bottom. Let's look at the video. So we have a pool table scenario and somebody shoots the initial shot, and lo and behold, what happens is not at all what you expected. Yes, and so of course this is kind of a joke, right, and a little bit of a funny video illustration, but the point really being, right, what you have just seen is you expect this initial pull shot and you expect the balls stay distributed widely, and you maybe check if one or two balls fall into a hole, right? But what happens in the end is super surprising for you, because you have definitely at the start of the event not expected this final constellation being the initial constellation again, which is of course physically nearly not possible. So we see that our brain continuously predicts not only the continuous pathways of balls and so forth, but it also has an imagination of the final event situation, even at the beginning of the event, right? So we think in this event segmented way about time and over time. And we have one example we have just recently published here with a development with psychologists. Here we have trained neural networks that predict when an event can start given a particular policy, and also essentially predicting in this case density over perceptual space when an event can start. We also predict how an event continues, so dynamics over the perceptual space while being in an event and pursuing a particular policy, and generating a predictive neural network model, feed-forward neural network model, in this case simple one, about when an event is likely to end. So the density over ending situations, essentially, given I'm in the current event EI, pursue a particular policy and perceive the current observation O. And with this model now, I have segmented my event structures. In this case, the segmentation was still given in advance. We use this to control our behavior. And so, for example, I can show you now how this equation works in this event kind of manner, and how the two components of the equation function. Imagine a little baby watching, sitting here on at the table. There's a basketball and there's a little teddy. And let's say the baby really loves the teddy, so we focus on the goal-directed component of the equation. So the M might say, I really want to look at teddy bears because I find them really cute, and so forth. And so my observations are densities over teddy bear-like features, right? So teddy bear features, and I really want to look at the teddy bear. So basically, I want to pursue behavior that gives me teddy bear feature inputs as observations. So essentially, saccade to the teddy bear. So my policy here is isocards. And I basically can control my isocards by desired perceptual templates, for example. But now let's say what happens next, focusing on the predicted uncertainty. Let's say the ball here suddenly starts to roll. So this is quite surprising, and I have suddenly a very high entropy here. Because something starts moving and I expect stability. So essentially, and I have a rather high predicted uncertainty of what the ball is going to do. So in order to gather further information of what's the ball, how is it rolling, and why is it rolling in the first place, I will saccade to this ball, essentially adjusting my policy to minimize free energy, anticipated free energy, essentially. Thus, looking at the ball to minimize my certainty, to increase my certainty about where the ball is going to roll. And once I'm rather certain about it, I know how the ball rolls, so I might think in an event-predictive well, when the ball rolls in this direction, it will fall down the table, and I'm curious what happens next. So I make an hypothesis, a jump in my event-predictive model space to the next boundary, predict that it will fall, and look at the edge, possibly saccade to that edge, specify more exactly where it will fall, and possibly even consider where it will land. Will it destroy something? Will it break? Will it be loud or whatnot? And further saccade to this. And lo and behold, we have simulated this with the model that I briefly explained to you with the event predictive components. have essentially simulated a developmental pathway that you can observe in infants. This is work now by Maurits Adam and Birgit Elsner, and also actually this one is published now as well already in the Frontiers Journal. So you can see in little children that about at 6 months of age, when you show them a hand reaching for an object and then grabbing it and lifting it, at 6 months of age, there's no anticipatory eye saccades in infants visible, right? They seem to track the hand or actually reactively look at the hand mainly. But about a little bit later, about 7.5 months old ones, they start to show anticipatory eye saccades. So the higher the position here of the dots here, the data points, essentially, the higher they are on this y-axis, the more the gaze arrives at the target object that the hand is reaching for, before the hand is actually there. So here we have an anticipatory eye saccade 250 milliseconds before the hand really reaches the object, and that can go up to a half second about. And at 7.5 months, we see this anticipatory eye saccades, but only when the hand is actually grasping the object. So when, of course, multiple trials, right? The first trials, there's of course no effect, and then, but the second, third trial, this effect emerges that you see the anticipatory eye saccades. Apparently because the children realize, this hand will do something with the object, and I want to know when this happens, want to prepare for this, observing this interaction, and so I look in anticipation of this. And interestingly, if the hand is just reaching for the object, but it's not manipulating the object, at 7.5 months of age, they do not show anticipatory eye saccades yet. But then at 11 months of age, the eye saccade develops. And when you do the whole thing with a mechanical claw, like a gripper thing, then the same pattern develops, but shifted temporarily at the age later in time. And so we can model this essentially. Let me jump a little bit in the interest of time. We can model this by this dynamic Bayesian event predictive model, giving learning event predictive Bayesian models first, essentially by neural networks that predict densities. And then we use it to infer both the action control and the observed behavior. So essentially we infer first what does the hand seem to do. Like, for example, if I see here this hand and this object, I might, the system, once it has learned, it will infer, the hand will be reaching for this object. When it then starts moving towards the object, it definitely falls into this reach event attractor and infers probabilistically, given the neural networks structures, that it's a reach. And then it can choose, and that's the reaching event. And the second one is the optimization of behavior, given its beliefs of which events are currently unfolding. Where should I look to minimize uncertainty in the near future, to minimize this free energy equation in the near future? And out of this minimization, optimization constraint, the policy develops that shifts its eyes in anticipation of the to be grasped object to the to be grasped object, similar like the babies do. And maybe we don't show I don't go with you through the results in depth, but what you essentially see is that over the training phase, the system learns better and better to infer which kind of event actually currently unfolds, and this is all probabilistically spelled out in the Bayesian equations. And it starts to, in fact, lo and behold, show similar anticipatory behavior for the hands, for the claws, not yet, because it never has experiences during training the artificial system, that is with using toys or tools to manipulate objects so far at this point, and we are working actually on this right now. So my second conclusion is essentially, well, okay, that's cool. So that's these event predictive structures. The question is really, how can these event predictive structures be learned, that is segmented over time without giving prior segmentation information? In fact, I said before, if you're cheating in the previous results here in this model, we have kind of cheated in the sense that we trained the system in a supervised manner, telling it, okay, this sensorimotor dynamics correspond to a reaching event, this corresponds to a grasping event, a transporting event, or holding still event, or random motion event we had pre-designed. And we are currently working with various architectures on developing automatic segmentations. Maybe let me jump briefly to the last architecture along these lines here. That is essentially this one, the gated L0 regularized recurrent neural network architecture. It's currently in press, will come out this year, still in NeurIPS 2021. It essentially maintains this architecture that we just talked about. Essentially, it maintains a latent state that is an event code, that is this hidden state H. And we design the neural network in a more protected manner than a long short-term memory structure or any other gated GRU-like recurrent neural network structure, and we enforce that this latent state stays stable over time as long as possible, essentially. And as possible means as long as the predictions of how the sensorimotor dynamics unfold are still in an acceptable range. Only when this is not the case, and this is only done with regularizations, regularizing loss terms, essentially, that I cannot explain in detail now, but only then it's essentially allowing to activate a switch and reset the latent hidden state, or let the latent hidden state change by a recommendation subnetwork. So we have a gating subnetwork that decides when to open or close the switch. That is when an event, essentially intuitively speaking, when an event switches. And the recommendation system essentially gives the prediction which next event will come at this switch. And by adding particular loss terms with essentially punishing gate openings, but making sure that this error, the reproduction error, is stronger than the gate opening punishment at a certain point, then a structure evolves that gets really good latent states. I can show you one of the latent states that are developing here when we have this billiard ball scenario and you want to predict the ball that's shot and like bounces off the two walls here. And if you train this with GRU and LSTM, they get reasonably similarly good predictions. Actually, if you look at the test prediction error stays more or less similar if you look at the B plot here with the gate load, LSTM, and GRU, but it generalizes better, and maybe even more important, the gate load architecture generalizes better, and more importantly, maybe you see also that you get a really lovely kind of explanation of what the ball is currently doing in this latent state of the gate load architecture, identifying essentially the switch, the wall bounce, and the second wall bounce, which is more or less exactly at this point in time and at this point in time. And with the GRU and LSTM, the latent states do a lot of other things and are much less systematic. And so this might be already exciting, but we actually can even show that you can then use this property, that these latent states are much more controlled and hidden and really characterize kind of the individual event segments to plan then in a much deeper and much faster session. So here we have this gripper, and the robot arm learns to really move the toy ball, toy block to particular positions. And there again, when you have a test generalization, so here, for example, we had the training. During training, the data was always such that the gripper object contact happened at time point 5. And testing is also at time point 5. There we don't see any differences between the different architectures. But actually, if the grasp occurs later, so this confound is waived in the generalization test, then the other networks are much less robust to handle the predictions and compared to our architecture that shields these latent states and makes sure that latent states really foster explainability and causality in the environment. You can see in the paper various other tasks, also the mini grid world, which is kind of a standard benchmark in reinforcement learning domain. So in fact, we just then in this benchmark, we just removed the LSTM structure in some reinforcement learning model and plugged in the gate lord structure. And lo and behold, the system was learning much faster and more reliable than the comparative, the architecture that system was compared to. So I guess we have to come to an end. So I just want to briefly point out that we also work on showing that these event predictive structures can be rather well linked to language structures. So you might know our previous good old Super Mario video that you still find on YouTube, but we also have expanded on this further with various other architectures, where you essentially, maybe let me jump over this explanation here and just briefly show you the learner architecture, the idea of it. Essentially, here we train a system, simple neural networks feed-forward system of learning particular events that like objects falling down, these little viruses. Sorry, this was all done before Corona, so the virus is a little unfortunate now. But nonetheless, you push down these things, and the system learns event structures out of it, and then after learning and after having been trained to link the individual event structures to words and verbs and being provided with the grammar, it then can construct itself an interpretation of a sentence, actually creating an internal simulation with its event models of what it hears. So for example, if the system is probed with, okay, explain to me, essentially, you can imagine it says that what could happen when I say the green virus rests on the platform and it moves to the box after it falls. So rather complex sentence, and its explanation is it arranges these three objects that are involved here in this manner, and in shorter now you see that essentially the green virus here, it falls on the platform, so after it falls it rests on the platform then, and then it moves to this green box. And this is one possible explanation of this rather ambiguous sentence in such a little, still admittedly a rather toy-like domain, but learned fully autonomously, really seeing videos like the one that you have seen here, and just analyzing what's moving, what starts moving at certain situational constraints and so forth. Even things like to the box are possible to encode in the sensorimotor event predictive manner. One can even use this socially to learn socially about each other, again using more or less similar formalisms. There the anticipation plays out with what the other person might think when I say certain things. Also, that is possible, and but that brings me to the final full slide as the final message of my presentation to do on my presentation of our lab's work. Also, that I wanted to convey today to you, that on the human cognition side, essentially, where it seems that our generative minds have two self-motivated objectives. The one is essentially to act highly flexibly and goal-directed. Thus, we build these complex models about our world and pursue epistemic self-motivated actions. Thus, we learn more about the world in a self-motivated, information-seeking kind of manner. We learn event-predictive models in the event-predictive conceptualizations to act in our world even much more flexibly than if we would have just flat models about how the actual sensorimotor dynamics unfold. And this event-predictive bias seems to help us to develop conceptualizations of the environment and thus enable us to plan in a deeper, goal-directed manner. To learn such conceptualizations, we need definitely suitable inductive learning biases in our models, such as surprise signals are really important. So temporary, unexpected stuff that's happening, and also gatings, as you've seen in the gate layered architecture briefly in the end. And these developing conceptualizations then truly enable goal-directed, self-motivated planning, reasoning, and behavior on multiple levels of abstraction. And I just could give you a hint in the interest of time that language can be mapped onto such conceptualizations rather easily, even enabling social relevant social interactions along the same kind of manner. Non-artificial intelligence side, which might be even more interesting for you, I think one can safely say that most current deep learning systems do not really foster the development of such event-predictive generative models. And as others have said, they may maybe thus be called highly demanding, computationally demanding stochastic parrots. Maybe that's a little bit overstretched. Certainly in the latent states of mu0 and others, certain conceptual structures seem to evolve, but I believe they can be much better fostered. The development of these structures can be much better fostered when we focus more on these event predictive generative systems, because they tend to show the tendency to develop underlying causal models of the environment. They may thus explain the encounter environment, right? You essentially design the latent state such that it's suitable. It's by definition, by design, structures itself such that it can explain the outside environment, right? So you develop systems that are designed to explain stuff. So obviously they're immediately also explainable much better than by themselves. And lo and behold, they learn themselves the explanations. They may be robust thus against to generate forecasts, as we have seen in the gate-layered architecture. It generalizes much well and can get rid of statistical confounds that are non-causal. And if I may end with my own opinion, these systems may indeed be able to develop through strong AI, or artificial general intelligence. And as a word of caution, I want to end with a message that if we do this, and if all of us that work on AI, smart robotics, and so forth, please keep in mind that we should put good purpose into such systems, such that they are useful for us as a world and society, and are not only there to make particular companies and individual people rich. That's it from my side. Some of the basics of this talk you can find in my recent book as a general introduction to cognitive science from my computational perspective. And I like to thank the Humboldt Foundation for supporting me and the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, in particular amongst the University of Tübingen, of course, and the machine learning cluster and other groups. And so I end with thank you for your attention.